From the birth of a nation to the challenges of the modern world, each Canadian Prime Minister has left a lasting mark on history. Over more than 150 years, their leadership, vision, and decisions have shaped Canada's story. This is the evolution of the Prime Ministers of Canada, from the very beginning to right now. John Macdonald. Macdonald is Canada's founding Prime Minister, the man who made Confederation happen. He united the provinces into one country on July 1st, 1867, and drove the construction of the Transcontinental Railway that connected the nation coast to coast. His legacy is complex, celebrated for building Canada but deeply criticized for his role in the cruel treatment of Indigenous peoples and the Chinese Exclusion Act. Alexander Mackenzie. Mackenzie became Canada's first Liberal Prime Minister and the first to take office without being a Confederation father. A self-made stonemason turned politician, he was known for his honesty and plain-spoken style. His government introduced the secret ballot and created the Supreme Court of Canada. Sir John Abbott. Abbott took over after a political scandal forced Macdonald's resignation and is often remembered as a reluctant prime minister. He famously said he was chosen simply because he was not as offensive as others. He served quietly and stepped down after less than 2 years due to ill health. Sir John Thompson. Thompson was a sharp legal mind and one of Canada's most capable early prime ministers. He modernized the Criminal Code of Canada, bringing it into a single, organized body of law. Tragically, he died suddenly in office in 1894. Sir Mackenzie Bowell. Bowell had one of the most embarrassing times anyone has ever had as Prime Minister. Imagine showing up to work one day and finding out that almost your entire team has quit, all at once, and publicly called you unfit for the job. That is exactly what happened to him. His own cabinet ministers walked out together in protest. He managed to finish his term, but at the end, his reputation ruins. Sir Charles Tupper. Tupper was one of the original men who helped create Canada as a country, but by the time he finally became Prime Minister, he was already 74 years old. His government lasted only 69 days, one of the shortest in Canadian history. Sir Wilfrid Laurier. Laurier made history as Canada's first French-Canadian Prime Minister, and many consider him one of the greatest leaders the country has ever had. Under his watch, Canada boomed. Thousands of immigrants flooded into the prairies, the economy grew, and the country felt full of possibility. He was charming, spoke both English and French beautifully, and boldly declared that the 20th century would belong to Canada. Sir Robert Borden. Borden led Canada through one of the darkest and most difficult periods in world history, the First World War. He sent Canadian soldiers to fight in Europe and pushed hard for Canada to be treated as its own independent nation on the world stage, not just a small piece of the British Empire. By the end of the war, Canada had earned its own seat at the peace talks, a huge moment for the young country. He also oversaw women gaining the right to vote in federal elections in 1918. Arthur Meighen. Meighen was one of the sharpest debaters in Canadian political history, but sharp words alone could not keep him in power. He served 2 short, stormy terms and is best remembered for a dramatic constitutional crisis, a bitter argument over whether the Governor-General had the right to refuse the Prime Minister's request to call an election. He lost both elections he fought and eventually walked away from politics, deeply frustrated. William Lyon Mackenzie King. King holds the record as Canada's longest-serving Prime Minister, and his story is unlike any other. He guided the country through the Great Depression and the Second World War, 2 of the most devastating events of the 20th century. But behind the scenes, he was deeply eccentric, secretly consulting the spirit of his late mother and even his pet dog through seances. Strange personal life aside, He was a masterful political survivor who shaped modern Canada more than almost anyone else. Richard Bedford Bennett. Bennett had the terrible luck of becoming Prime Minister right as the Great Depression hit, throwing millions of Canadians into poverty. He tried public works and relief programs, but many felt he was too wealthy and too out of touch to truly understand their suffering. Near the end of his term, he pushed for sweeping reforms, but it was too little, too late. He was defeated badly by Mackenzie King and eventually left Canada altogether, retiring to England. Louis Saint Laurent. Canadians loved Saint Laurent so much they called him Uncle Louis. He had a warm, steady, grandfatherly presence that put people at ease. During his time in office, Newfoundland joined Canada in 1949, making it the country's 10th province. He also helped build NATO and guided Canada through a long stretch of post-war prosperity and confidence. John Diefenbaker. Diefenbaker was a prairie lawyer who never forgot where he came from. He fought passionately for the rights of ordinary Canadians and introduced the Canadian Bill of Rights, the first time the country had ever written down protections for individual freedoms in one national document. He won a massive election victory, but his relationship with the United States grew tense over nuclear weapons, and eventually, his own cabinet turned against him. Lester B. Pearson. Before he even became Prime Minister, Pearson had already won the Nobel Peace Prize, and his time in office lived up to that reputation. He gave Canada its own iconic maple leaf flag, introduced universal health care so all Canadians could see a doctor regardless of their income, and launched the Canada Pension Plan to protect seniors. Quiet and thoughtful, he transformed Canada into a modern, fairer country without making a lot of noise doing it. Pierre Elliott Trudeau. When Trudeau arrived on the national scene in 1968, Canada went a little crazy for him. People called it Trudeau-mania. He was unlike any prime minister Canada had seen before. Intellectual, stylish, and fearless. He made Canada officially bilingual, welcomed people of all backgrounds, and gave Canadians the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which to this day protects the basic rights of every person in the country. But he also had a controversial side, declaring emergency powers during a crisis in Quebec that many felt went too far. Joe Clark. At just 39 years old, Clark became the youngest prime minister in Canadian history, but his time at the top was brief and bumpy. His minority government lasted only 9 months before it was defeated on a budget vote in Parliament, meaning he never even got a full year on the job. Despite the rocky start, he later made valuable contributions in international diplomacy, particularly in helping to end apartheid in South Africa. John Turner. Turner had waited a long time to become Prime Minister, and when his moment finally came in 1984, it slipped away almost immediately. He was Prime Minister for just 79 days before calling an election and losing badly to Brian Mulroney. He is best remembered for a memorable and fiery moment during a televised debate, but the political tide was simply too strong to swim against. Brian Mulroney. Mulroney was a smooth, confident dealmaker from Quebec who reshaped Canada's place in the world economy. His biggest achievement was signing the Free Trade Agreement with the United States, later expanded into NAFTA, opening up trade between the two neighbors like never before. He also introduced the Goods and Services Tax, which Canadians deeply disliked at the time, but which became a permanent and important source of government revenue. His government ended badly, dragged down by scandal, and his party was left in ruins. Kim Campbell. Campbell made history as Canada's first, and so far only, female Prime Minister. But she stepped into a job that was already in deep trouble. She inherited an unpopular government and had to face voters just months after taking over. The result was one of the most stunning collapses in Canadian political history. Her party fell from 156 seats in Parliament to just 2. It was not the legacy she deserved. but it was the one history handed her. Jean Chrétien. Chrétien was a tough, plain-speaking politician from a small town in Quebec who proved again and again that he could not be counted out. He won 3 back-to-back majority governments, a rare achievement. He kept Canada out of the Iraq War, turned years of budget deficits into surpluses, and passed laws to keep the country together when Quebec's independence movement was at its peak. He governed through a decade of stability and growth, and Canadians mostly look back on his era fondly. Paul Martin. Martin had been one of Canada's most celebrated finance ministers, famous for cleaning up the country's finances and ending the deficit. But moving from finance minister to prime minister proved much harder. Scandals from the previous government followed him into office and never let go. He did manage to legalize same-sex marriage and signed a historic agreement with Indigenous leaders. But his time at the top was short, and he never fully escaped the shadow of his predecessor. Stephen Harper. Harper governed Canada for nearly a decade with a calm, controlled, and disciplined approach. When the 2008 global financial crisis hit, Canada came through it better than most countries in the world, something Harper pointed to with pride. He cut taxes, signed trade deals across the globe, and kept a steady hand on the country's finances. His critics, however, felt he silenced scientists, kept Parliament in the dark too often, and failed to build meaningful relationships with Indigenous communities. Justin Trudeau. Trudeau, son of the legendary Pierre Elliott Trudeau, swept into power in 2015 on a wave of excitement and optimism. He legalized cannabis, put a price on carbon pollution, and proudly promoted diversity and inclusion both at home and around the world. But after a decade in power, the excitement faded, ethics scandals piled up, his approval ratings dropped sharply, and in early 2025, he announced he was stepping down, closing one of the most talked about chapters in modern Canadian political history. Mark Carney. In 2025, Canada turned to someone completely outside the world of traditional politics. Mark Carney, a world-respected economist who had previously led both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, was elected leader of the Liberal Party and sworn in as Canada's 24th Prime Minister in March 2025. He made history as the first Prime Minister ever to take office without having previously held any elected position. He arrived at a moment of real tension, a trade war brewing with the United States, questions about Canadian sovereignty, and an economy in need of direction. His story is still being written. Which Prime Minister do you think made the biggest impact on Canada? Let us know in the comments.